Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we remind you that you can't make it great again, because it wasn't that great to begin with. The Unicorn Book of 1952 was so fascinating that we decided to look at it again. This unique series of books from the 1950s recorded history as it happened. All these years later, we think it's interesting to see how different some things used to be. And sometimes it's surprising how much has remained the same. Let's start by looking at some of the most impressive inventions of the early 1950s. Technology. In 1952, it finally became possible to manufacture transistors in great quantities. This allowed companies to make products that were smaller and more power efficient. Technology progressed quickly in the early 1950s. When Bell Telephone Laboratories scientists invented the transistor in 1948, they predicted its future greatness. Not until 1953, however, was the first transistor product on the market, a hearing aid much smaller than any ever constructed with tubes. Because transistors use so little power, the gadget operated for months on batteries the size of a dime. The Radio Corporation of America, which had obtained licenses from Bell Labs, exhibited a startling array of experimental transistor machines, all powered by batteries the diameter of a quarter. One was a portable television receiver, smaller than a standard typewriter and tubeless except for the picture tube. Another was an 8-key toy piano about the size of a child's pencil box, which broadcast eerie notes through a radio loudspeaker. In addition to manufacturing electronic devices, scientists were trying to unlock the secrets of space travel. Unfortunately, they sacrificed animals in the pursuit of knowledge. Real rocket enthusiasts are certain they could build a rocket that would fly to the moon if only they had the money. But could a passenger survive the ride? A partial answer came from the rocket proving grounds at White Sands, New Mexico. 3 white mice took off in the noses of rockets. Television cameras installed in the pressurized cabins watched their reactions as they soared into the upper atmosphere. When the rockets reached their zeniths, flipped over, and plunged downward through the thin air, the mice became essentially weightless, experiencing, to an exaggerated degree, the feeling of descending in a fast elevator. 2 of the mice thrashed in panic until the rockets hit thicker air and stopped accelerating. 5 monkeys who similarly took rocket trips were not so lucky. They were doped with morphine and rested comfortably on sponge rubber mattresses while instruments radioed back to Earth the changes in their blood circulation and breathing. Apparently, the trip caused no ill effects, but all the landings were fatal. 4 of the monkey-carrying rockets crashed when their parachutes failed to snap open. The 5th got down safely enough, but the monkey died of heat prostration in the desert. UFO sightings were also extremely common in 1952, and they appeared all over the world. An airline pilot spotted a green, tear-shaped glow going like a bat out of hell over Indiana. At the Atomic Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, observers watched an apparently metallic object gyrate on high for half an hour. In Chenango County, New York, crowds gathered to watch a whole flotilla of shiny balls. The crew of a Canadian destroyer in Korean waters spotted 2 shiny discs aloft and picked them up in their radar screen. Medical technology was also moving forward at an accelerated pace. However, some of the problems we have today were present then as well. Antibiotic resistance became a problem very quickly. For one golden day in 1952, the world's most lethal germ disease seemed to have been conquered. The news leaked out that 92 tuberculosis patients, all advanced cases, had been cured by a new wonder drug under test at Seaview Hospital in New York. To the delight of news photographers, the supposedly cured men and women danced and cavorted in the wards. Sound medical caution dampened the first enthusiasm, but all in all, the new drug, isonicotinic hydrazine, a chemical cousin of a B vitamin, still added up to an effective aid against TB. Promising as the new drug was, it quickly developed a weakness. TB bacilli learned to live with it, as they had learned to live with streptomycin. Entertainment. After the end of World War II, people in the 1950s prospered. They also spent a lot on entertainment. Despite the impression we have today of the 1950s being a very conservative time, some artists pushed the limits of morality. Originally presented on Christmas night of 1940, Pal Joey was highly sophisticated and vastly different from the typical musical comedy of the day, which usually combined straightforward sentiment with sheer slapstick. Its story of a loose-living woman of wealth who bought her pleasures with the men she wanted proved distasteful to many theatergoers. One drama critic wrote, "You cannot draw sweet water from a foul well." The proliferation of televisions created headaches for Hollywood. It fought to remain relevant as viewers embraced convenience. In 1952, competition from television was again Hollywood's biggest headache. Some studios still fought a delaying action, denying TV the use of films and stars. But by and large, people were getting their entertainment in their own living rooms. Weekly movie attendance, estimated at 55 million, was far below wartime peaks and no higher than in 1951. One way Hollywood tried to fight back was with a new and unique theater experience, the 3D film. For 1952 saw a rebirth of a fascinating illusion, the so-called three-dimensional film. In this technique, promptly dubbed 3D, movie makers felt they had a magnet that again would pull record audiences into their theaters. Pictures that create an illusion of depth were actually nothing new. Grandma's Stereopticon, through which she peered at twin photographs of Niagara Falls, was a primitive example of 3D familiar to many Americans. The Unicorn Book of 1952 also noted the appearance of a soon-to-be superstar. Turning from cinema techniques to personalities, the largest stir of the year must be credited to the rapid rise of Marilyn Monroe, a hip-swinging young blonde of unmistakable new charm. During the year, Miss Monroe made 5 pictures, each a success. Miss Monroe, aided by the unwearying efforts of her press agents, became to some extent the symbol of the industry. And what they failed to accomplish, a romance with Joe DiMaggio, former great Yankee outfielder, achieved with ease. Despite Hollywood's attempts to maintain its dominance, several movie stars made the switch to television. Other movie stars besides Lucille Ball made the jump into television and must now be considered primarily as TV stars. Both Groucho Marx and Dinah Shore became staple TV fare, and the termination of Joan Crawford's contract with Warner Brothers also appeared to have TV overtones. Less directly, Bing Crosby became an important participant in TV programming when a subsidiary of his corporation, Bing Crosby Enterprises, signed a $4 million contract to make television films. It calls for 208 half-hour films and makes Crosby's firm the largest producer of TV film footage. Religion. In the 1950s, the United States was an extremely religious nation. The Unicorn Book made note of this fact. In 1952, approximately 89 million Americans belonged to a church. It was the largest number of church members ever recorded in the United States, 58% of the population as contrasted with 49% in 1949. The 1950s also saw the rise of the television evangelist. During 1952, Billy Graham stormed Washington, D.C. with the cry, "Repent!" In 9 weeks, 500,000 people attended his rallies, nearly 2/3 of the capital's population. Each night, some 25 to 40 representatives and about 5 senators came, but to Billy's disappointment, Baptist Harry Truman didn't. Billy warned Washingtonians that some were following the debauchery of Belshazzar's feast, which he dubbed the greatest cocktail party in history. The churchgoers of the United States paid their dues, and as a result, churches went on a spending spree. Construction was at an all-time high. With building restrictions off, a boom in church building was on, and 6 times as much construction was going up as in 1946. $1 billion worth of Protestant church plans was on architects' drawing boards. The Roman Catholic Church planned to spend $1 billion a year from 1945 to 1955, erecting 150 to 200 churches a year. New temples and synagogues were rising in many cities. Even those who succeeded in avoiding church couldn't escape the reach of religion. It infiltrated every form of entertainment in 1952. Religious books invaded the bestseller list in 1952, from the Revised Standard Version of the Bible to Norman Beasley's The Cross and the Crown, a history of the Christian Science movement and its founder Mary Baker Eddy. An estimated 200 religious films were produced in 1952 alone, and many were shown on TV. Despite the upsurge in religious life, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of the Marble Collegiate Church in New York City, found that Americans now are probably the most nervous generation ever. Books. Most people still didn't have access to television and rarely visited movie theaters. Books were a more widespread form of entertainment. However, sometimes authors were less than honest. In one way, the most unusual achievement of the year was a book written by a convict in the Ohio State Penitentiary, Robert E. Prayer Jr. In the fall of 1952, the Boston publishers Little, Brown & Company received a partially completed manuscript from Prayer entitled Position Unknown. They liked it, advanced him $500 to finish the book, and waited. Finally, in December, the last chapters arrived. The book was set in type and advance copies were mailed to critics. Only one thing was wrong with Position Unknown: it had been written once before. They did not bring action against the author. He was already in jail. One farmer appeared from seemingly nowhere with one of the longest books ever written. If 1952 introduced no new writers of outstanding promise, it did bring forth one of the most ambitious, a 59-year-old Waco, Texas wholesale grocery merchant named Madison Cooper. For 11 years, Cooper secretly spun the story of a small southern city he calls Saronia, Texas. Page by page, the novel grew until at last it became somewhat longer than the Old and New Testaments combined. The novel, Saronia, Texas, is the longest ever published, 1,731 pages. At the almost unheard of price of $10, it sold surprisingly well, about 23,000 copies. In fact, by year's end, for a gross take of almost $250,000. In 1952, there was also a new version of the Bible. Its arrival did not make everyone happy. The most successful book of the year, as in every year, was the Bible, but it was not the well-known King James Version, the Bible that grandfather kept on his parlor table. The new Bible was called the Revised Standard Version, and it was newly translated from the Hebrew language by a group of divinity scholars at a cost of $500,000. Its public reception was controversial. In Rocky Mount, North Carolina, the pastor of one church burned it in public with a blowtorch. Others denounced it from their pulpits. Harry Truman's opponent in the Democratic primary of 1952 also surprised the publishing world. For one of the few times in history, a presidential candidate collected his campaign speeches and sold them. They were the speeches of Adlai Stevenson, and it was clear from reading them that whatever else the Democratic nominee might be, he was well versed in the world of books. The speeches were magnificent. The publishing industry also grew rapidly with the adoption of paperback books, which were cheaper to produce. It became evident by 1952 that the paper-bound book was profoundly altering the structure of the publishing industry. Books, as never before, were becoming an agency of mass culture in competition with the movies, radio, and television. Against a price of $3 or more for a hardbound book, the paperbacks were selling at $25, $35, and 50 cents. Against 2,000 outlets for trade books, there were 100,000 for reprints. The effect of this was healthy. It brought books within reach of men and women to whom a book is ordinarily a luxury. People. Much like today, in 1952, everyone had an opinion about famous people. One of the polls from that year was recorded. A poll of the governors of the 48 states conducted by the Columbia Broadcasting System named General Douglas MacArthur as the man of 1951, with General Eisenhower a runner-up. For the second time in a row, John Wayne, poker-faced star of Western movies, was tagged Most Popular Actor of the Year by the Motion Picture Herald. For the first time, Britain's Prince Margaret got on the New York Dress Institute list of the 10 best-dressed women. Long before Will Smith, famous actors were slapping people. The audience in a Hollywood theater was treated to the spectacle of actor James Mason getting up, walking down the aisle, and slapping a man who had been talking during the movie. As the slap resounded, Mason recognized his target, playwright William Saroyan. "Oh, hello, Bill," said Mason. "Shut up, will you?" Elizabeth Taylor was just a teenager in 1952, but she was also on her second marriage. For 19-year-old film beauty Elizabeth Taylor and 39-year-old actor Michael Wilding, both recently divorced from former mates, there was a nick-of-time break that permitted a London wedding, after it was found that she had forgotten her divorce papers. The day was saved when an American news agency had them radio phoned across the Atlantic. Some criminals were famous too. One bank robber was particularly worried about his collection of recipes. After a nationwide chase by police and the FBI, Hollywood bank robber John Richard Bayless was captured as he stepped off a plane at LaGuardia Airport in New York. He turned his loot over willingly, but begged arresting officers, "Don't take my cookbook," which contained recipes he had compiled during a 12-year stretch in Alcatraz. Hollywood's newest and greatest star admitted to making a controversial decision. Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's flashiest new star, gave her studio a good case of jitters by candidly admitting to reporters that she was the model who posed for a notable nude calendar back in 1949 when she needed rent money. Very promptly, a brisk business in calendars, both reprints of the original and close imitations, was noticed across the nation. What do you think about these events from 1952? Did you learn anything new? Is the world a better place today? Tell us what you think about the episode in the comments. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, where we will cover the Unicorn Book of 1953. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.